Awesome. Thanks, Nico, and thanks for the opportunity to be here with you today virtually. It's really exciting. I was joking with Nico that I've never been able to be at Urbanism Next because it always coincides exactly with the City of LA's budget season. And so this year, I'm able to do both, and I'm really excited to participate. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. And hopefully, let's see. All right, so I'm hoping that you all can see that. And you can see this is an image from the city of LA in the 1960s. And the 1960s were a period of, Eisenhower's sort of freeway building binge was fully underway. And it was also the decade that the city of Los Angeles dismantled our last streetcar lines in the city. And this image is looking at downtown. That's City Hall there, used to be the tallest building in downtown. And the skyline looks really different now. But what doesn't look different is this legacy of neighborhoods that were completely erased, displaced, and bulldozed in service of laying down this enormous piece of mobility infrastructure. And when you couple that with the legacy of redlining, what you get is generations of people held back from building wealth and instead put in the position of sort of generational poverty and generational trauma. And the thing that this virus is exposing, among many, many others, is that legacy. And the same neighborhoods that you see here that are sort of surrounded by freeways are the ones that are bearing the disproportionate burden of the virus. And I think that it's important to realize that cities didn't spring fully grown like Athena from Zeus's head. They came to being as a result of several decisions that happened over generations from our city's foremothers and forefathers. And many of those decisions were overtly racist. And so now, as we sit in our seats and we're either occupied and thinking about the future or wrestling with the present, we cannot overlook that there is still a tremendous need to reckon with the past. So when lots of you think about Los Angeles, you think about a picture like this, an image of tremendous amounts of crushing congestion, hundreds of hours lost, people sitting in their cars, because mobility often ends up as a poor stand-in for public policy failures in other sectors. So people cannot afford to live near where they work. They have to commute long distances. And that is not going to stop being true as we emerge from the pandemic. But for a moment, the universe hit the pause button pretty hard and created images of Los Angeles that look more like images out of The Walking Dead or some other dystopic version of the future, where there was a tremendous amount of quiet and a complete and utter absence of activity in a lot of places where previously there had been just an overload of it. And that kind of abrupt shift had these results. This is a famous image of Los Angeles that got circulated when we had a couple of days of really excellent air quality. And just as to ground you, City Hall is that pointy building over there on the sort of far left of that skyline. And so, even though they were beautiful days and clear skies and quiet days where you could hear birds and you could hear the sounds of people talking and the sounds of your community, there was never an ability to fully escape the reason why that was. And, there was a sense that some of us felt safer in our homes, but really afraid whenever we went outside. Some of us have never felt safe in our homes. And also never felt safe outside. And all of a sudden we have this shared understanding of what it feels like to live in a city and never really be able to fully be yourself because the safe spaces have diminished or disappeared. And even though those of us who were lucky enough to be able to telecommute and be in our homes were able to spend that time, we also experience a sense of displacement because all of our physical simulation and stimulation is coming from the simulacrum. And so it's not real, and our bodies know it's not real, and we long for and crave proximity to other people. So just to ground you in Los Angeles, these are the numbers. They look a lot like other cities. Traffic volumes down considerable amounts. Bike volumes down too, but not by nearly as much. Dockless ridership down by over 90%. And that is not because of a lack of demand. It is because almost every operator in this city, where we had one of the largest open markets for dockless, removed their fleets. So we went from overnight having between 25 and 35,000 devices out on the streets to about 900. The Metro bike share, the publicly funded bike share system, stayed up and stayed in operation. And while we saw ridership dips there, they were not nearly as much as 90%. And I think the other fissure that the virus is exposing is that between public and private. What is the public sector's role in providing transportation and mobility, and what is the private sector's role in amplifying that? So congestion goes down, speed goes up. That's not hard to understand. It's you can see those freeways, and one of the sounds, the unwelcome sounds that I hear now outside my window is that of street racing that's happening across Los Angeles. And what that means is that even though crashes are down across the city and fatalities are down across the city, they're not down nearly as much as traffic volumes are down. And that's because when crashes occur, they're much more likely to be violent or deadly. So we've seen progress here in significant reductions in the number of pedestrian fatalities. You can see we were, prior to the pandemic, we had already begun seeing some progress finally after a few years of real sort of Vision Zero based system safety infrastructure investments. We had started to see a reduction already, but it's not nearly where you would think it would be if you looked at the volumes. And then there's a number that's hidden here, and the one that I can see because I'm operating the agency, and that is the real vast operational changes. So traffic officers have spent 3,000 more hours this year than last year directing traffic. And they're not out there directing traffic because it's congested. They're directing traffic at food drops, at diaper giveaways, at food pantries, at LA Unified grab and go meal centers, at testing sites. The nature of this job has changed, and these officers are standing out in the middle of this and interacting with people who are exhausted and afraid and broke and hungry and sick. It is a very, very different job than the one that they originally signed up for. So what are some guiding principles, or how are we thinking about at LADOT our jobs now and in the future? Because we're all sort of doing three jobs. We're doing the job that we had before the pandemic, we're doing the job of crisis response, and we're doing the job of thinking about the future. And so as a sci-fi geek from way back, I like to always consult the rules of time travel, because we're all hearing a tremendous amount of storytelling about the future, and it's either the best thing you could ever imagine, or it's so bad you'll want to forget it. But the fact that's immutable in all of this is that we cannot change the past. And if we do not figure out a way to atone and reckon with the past, then that's the thing that will hold us back from whatever future we are hoping to achieve. So whatever your pre-pandemic agenda was, I would really encourage you to think about, why did the New Deal come out of the Great Depression? It came out because there was a new power block between rural agricultural interests and labor. And unless we figure out a way to build a new power block here, it is very unlikely that the forces of competitive capitalism will not create a return to the status quo in very, very short order. So first and foremost, do no harm and figure out how to address the harm that came before you. So some of the first things we did were to make transit free, to open up rear door boarding, to stop writing parking tickets, to freeze all of the parking fines in place, to postpone any payments, any financial hardship that we might have been imposing on people in the past, we removed as quickly as we possibly could in order to try and as quickly as possible not engage in any more sort of harm to the communities that we serve in the form of financial penalties and fines. Our ridership on Dash is down 73%. but it is still thriving on some of the lines that we have, like the PICO Union line, where we are moving essential workers to their jobs. And what that means is that we now need to potentially have twice as many buses as we did before, because we're not carrying as many people per vehicle because of physical distancing. So that means that on the spine and the core line of the transit system, we need to actually double down on spaces for buses and frequency of service. Los Angeles is a famously sprawling city built on, this idea that you have really large streets that intersect with small ones. There are a lot of places in the city where nobody walks. And so almost every single one of our traffic signals, 5,000 of them, operates on operates as actuated. So you have to push the button to get the walk sign. We went through and undid that for about 20% of our intersections citywide. So that's 5,000 intersections across the city where we were able to say, we can't change the past, but now let's think about the way streets are used now and the way people need to use them. And let's use this as an opportunity to change the way that our signals work, not just because we want to raise up the primacy of people walking, but also because we wanted to slow traffic down. And when we do this, drivers encounter fewer green lights as they head along a corridor than they did in the past. I've heard a lot of calls for, rapid implementation of projects that have had little or no community oversight. And I know we like to trot out that old Rahm Emanuel battle axe about never letting a good crisis go to waste, but I just want to say that opportunism is not a permission slip for nonsense. And our challenge right now is to figure out how to lift up and elevate and go to the voices that have not previously led the planning in their own backyards, because what we will hear from them is that they want more than just a simple mobility system solution. And we have the resources to provide it. And if we are able to do that in a thoughtful way, that is how we will get to a different future. So when you listen to people, then you can be more clear about whose needs are being met. This is a food drop at the Crenshaw Mall, where traffic wrapped around the block, and people have never seen anything like it in their lifetime. And our people are moving around the city in a substantively different way. And our job at DOT is to figure out how can we make sure that those events are safe, and that we are managing the congestion and fulfilling the needs of the people whom we're serving. Some of the people we're serving are transit operators who found themselves in the position of being frontline workers. And how can we make sure that this workforce is afraid and exhausted and dealing with a lot of fear? And when you get on a bus right now, this is what it looks like. This is not an inviting, welcoming place to be. And it sends a message that we're really trying to keep people apart and keep people away from each other. We have to think deeply about the fact that a lot of Americans stored their debt in car loans over the last 5 years. And what that means is that, on a 7-year car loan, you might not even pay off the full value of the vehicle. So what happens when, we're not able to provide substantive transit and that fails, and when we're not able to people have to make a decision between paying off a car note and paying their rent, because if they pay their car note, then they have a place to live and they have a vehicle that can connect them to opportunity. It's still true in Los Angeles that you can get to 12 times as many jobs in an hour by car as you can in an hour by transit. And that delta is continuing to grow. So what would a public transit system look like that would be a massive expansion of a program like Blue LA? Blue LA is electric vehicle car sharing program that is in low-income neighborhoods throughout the city. What would it look like if we did a massive expansion of that so that cheap or perhaps even free electric vehicles were available to fill in that gap for people whose needs we want to serve? The transit system is not going to be able to fill in that gap. Blue LA actually ceased operations and then reopened last week and did a bunch of survey work. And what they found is that there's a big uptick from 55% to 75% in community members who are using the service. That's low or very low income folks who are taking advantage of this service. And the comments back in the surveys were, thank you for bringing this back online. It was too expensive to do everything by Uber and Lyft. So we know public transit is not going to be back in an extensive way anytime soon. That's a fiscal reality. We know that Uber and Lyft and private companies aren't necessarily providing that. So how can we step into that gap? We've put in a lot of temporary programs like this one, but how are we going to make a clear roadmap to take the 300 food pickup zones and turn them into parklets or 15-minute parking meters? It's not enough to set up an immediate quick response without a solid plan in place. And then policing is not a design strategy. So if you are thinking about a project and you want to put it in place, and what you hear is, yeah, we'll just have PD drive by every so often to make sure that people are using it the way it's designed, then it's a bad design. And if you're hearing, yeah, we'll just gather all this cell phone data and we'll make sure that we have all these AIs to determine if people are abiding by social distancing, then you need to go back to the drawing board. The last piece is really about collective healing. So people use the mobility system to express collective anger and grief and share experience and exercise their right to assemble. They can't do this anymore. So what would it look like if we began to bring true sort of self-care and healing into the design of our public spaces? When we think about how, we're going to emerge from this pandemic or learn to live with it, abstinence is not going to be a sustainable long-term strategy. And people are going to need to process everything that they've gone through during this moment and for the next several years. I live in the self-care capital of the universe. You can find a sound bath or a face mask without trying that hard, but they all have gatekeepers and tickets and they cost money and they're hard to get to. So how can we democratize public health, self-care, mental health, and healing using our plazas and public spaces and streets? So we're under tremendous budgetary pressure, I think, just like everybody else. And it's going to be really tempting to pull back all of the things that we do to just keeping the traffic signals on and writing parking tickets. But we cannot forget that the private markets and the investment that's still happening in technology is going to accelerate. And we have to make sure that we take seriously the lessons learned from the pandemic and that we cannot rely on the private sector to fill in the gaps on the sort of essential functions of the mobility system. We need to make sure that technology and digital transformation remain a core part and become a core part of what we do, or we risk losing our public streets, our spaces, our public skies to privatization. And I think that is a pressure that's going to continue, and it's something that we have to be really mindful of. We happen to be in the middle of our strategic plan, redoing it, and we are beginning to rethink all of our mission and vision. And I'll just tease out a couple of things here that my perception is that everything we do must, from here on out, must create jobs, must push back on climate change, and must create a more sustainable and equitable outcome in the future for everybody that we serve. Thank you.
Seleta, thank you so much. It's always so fascinating, and I love listening to your presentations and all the different places that I have. And I know I have really been thinking about the role of government and how it's changing to respond and to be more resilient during this pandemic. But then how do we think about that into the future? And so you had kind of alluded to that you're having to respond and rethink it. And especially related to, creating a new power block. Could you just talk a little bit more about that and that concept and how you're thinking about it?
Yeah, so I think we've been trying to figure out what are the right roles of public, private, nonprofit, academic sectors. And, there's everybody gets a Green New Deal these days, and Mayor Garcetti has one, and it's outstanding. But for a while there, it felt a little bit like everybody was getting a Green New Deal, but nobody was looking back at history and trying to understand, how did that earlier New Deal go? How'd that go for everybody, and how did it come into being? And I think it looks a lot like, I've been thinking quite a bit about how can we strengthen and continue to sort of lift up the connections that we have between advocates who care about, bike lanes or bus lanes, and labor organizations who care about the safety of frontline workers and transit workers, and folks who are working deeply in community-based organizations and trying to deliver basic aid to the people that they serve, faith-based leaders who were important before and have become more important during the pandemic. What would that kind of a coalition look like? And what would it would be? I feel like the questions that would emerge would be so much more interesting, and the solutions that would come out of that would be so much more powerful, because this is also a moment when, I mean, even I was reading my friend Gabe Klein was joking that even Steve Mnuchin is talking about how government has a role to play. And, we've experienced several years of people losing trust in government. And this is a moment when everyone is looking to government for solutions and answers and wisdom. So let's not squander that moment by running roughshod over community process, and instead figure out how we can strengthen our shared responsibility and credibility to make real transformational change.
I'm we have time for probably just one more question. So I'm gonna combine two from our attendees. And this is really thinking about the responsibility that government and especially transit has to do two things: to ensure that the people are safe and safe from, say, a pandemic. So the responsibility we might have to think about social distancing, you had the great slide. But then also to ensure that the essential workers, the people that are both dependent on transit or some other kind of transportation that's maybe not their own personally owned vehicle, to be able to access that when they need to, so they can get to their jobs and keep, what economy is out there, keep it running. And so, so what do you think is the responsibility then of those transit agencies to really kind of get in front of the perception hit from COVID-19 and get it up and running, and both keeping people safe and potentially prioritizing those essential workers?
Yeah, I think the challenge is, and this is one that we continue to wrestle with, how can we disentangle auto access from auto ownership? Because, and I'm using here auto access as a proxy for opportunity access, right? Because in most US cities, that's what it is. If you don't own a car, it affects all kinds of things about your ability to build wealth, your economic mobility, even rates of recidivism for folks. So what our responsibility is that, how can we make it easy and safe and seamless for people to get the kind of vehicle they need when they need it? And I think that, bikes and bike share and dockless and all of those things are definitely part of the solution. But there are a lot of reasons why whole sectors of society never felt safe on a bike. Sexism, harassment, racism, policing, disability, all kinds of reasons why that can't be the only solution. And so how can we bring EV car sharing into that, and really a new municipal model for EV car sharing, where it is as cheap and easy for especially low-income folks to access that, and for that to amplify that trunk line transit service that we provide. This is kind of the moment to disentangle those things from a funding perspective, and even to see if we can tease out some of the money that's coming into public transit under a broader definition to provide that kind of relief and access, so that getting to the opportunity is the last thing that people need to worry about.
That's great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your time, and glad we could work it in this year. There's silver linings. There's definitely silver linings.
Thanks so much.